Uh, Colleagues, talofa, I think we'll get started. Kia ora tātou, and welcome to the online launch of the Caritas State of the Environment uh, for Oceania Report 2020 towards New Horizons. So these reports have been released each year since 2014 around the feast of St. Francis on the 4th of October. St. Francis of Assisi is the patron saint of ecology and had a deep love of creation and the poor. His feast day also concludes the season of creation, which began on the 1st of September. In the Southern Hemisphere, it is also springtime when we experience and celebrate new life. The Caritas Oceania Environment Report Series is a collaborative project sharing stories from the grassroots and coastal edges of Oceania on how environmental issues are impacting people and how they are responding. We aim to amplify the voices of Oceania peoples, especially those of the poorest most affected by environmental degradation. We seek action for the common good by decision makers and those with power in our region. Most of you will know that Caritas is a Latin word that means love or aroha. Caritas in Oceania comprises the Caritas agencies of Tonga, Samoa, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Australia, and Aotearoa New Zealand, as well as member churches of the Episcopal Conference of the Pacific, which covers most of the South Pacific Islands. Each Caritas member is accountable to its local Catholic bishops. And together we are part of the Caritas Internationalis network of 165 Catholic development and social justice agencies working in more than 200 countries and territories around the world. So talofa, my name is Tim Bass. I am a Pacific advisor for the report, and I'm delighted to be here to chair our talanoa today and introduce you to our panelists. But before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Global Catholic Climate Movement in hosting this webinar. In particular, thanking Cheryl Dugan, who's based in the Philippines, who behind the scenes is taking care of the technology for us. And also Marita Tana of Caritas Aotearoa New Zealand, who will be monitoring questions and discussion in the chat box to feed into our Q&A session. I'd also like to acknowledge all of you, our guests in the webinar. In particular, I'd like to welcome Cardinal Suane Mafi, head of the Catholic Church in Tonga, Father Besamino Victor from Samoa and his colleagues, Monsignor Jared Burns, and any other distinguished guests I've missed. Welcome and thank you for joining. So just a bit of housekeeping. Just going to give a brief overview of the schedule for our talanoa today. Shortly, we will start with a prayer to acknowledge land, oceans, and people, but also to ground our talanoa. I will then invite each of the main panelists to introduce themselves. Following that introduction, Martin de Jong, who is the lead author and researcher for the report, will give background and context to the reports, and then later talk about a section on offshore mining and drilling. We'll then hear from Ursula Rakova from the Carteret Islands, who will provide a case study on climate finance, or lack thereof. Following Ursula, we'll hear from Amelia Maafu and her team from Caritas Tonga, who will share case studies of impact arising from cyclones, which have been complicated by the current COVID pandemic. In the final case study, Kosita Tino Tikumai Bolatangane of Caritas Fiji will share impact of coastal erosion and sea level rise in Fiji and interplay with climate finance. So after the presentations from our panelists, we'll conclude with some final remarks and some key recommendations from each of the panelists. So for our participants today, If you have a question along the way during the presentation, please feel free to record these in the chat box. And please also ensure that you name the person who you are directing your question to. So Marita and I will figure out how to collect those questions and put them to the panelists after the talanoa. So we will have about 10 minutes for Q&A and then finish off with a closing prayer. So that is our schedule for today. Thank you again for joining. I'm now going to invite Te Pou Hohua to open our webinar with a prayer and acknowledgement in Te Reo Māori, our first language of Aotearoa. Kia ora.
Whano, haramai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tāiki e. Nā ngā tamariki, arangi nui, me papatua anuku, ka puta mātou ki te whai ao, ki te ao mārama. Nei oku mihi kia koutou katoa, e mātaki mai ana ki tēnei whakaahua, e hui mai nei, e wānanga mai nei, ki te kōrero, ki te wānanga, e pāna ki tō tātou nei tai au, me tana oranga. E tika ana, me tuku aku mihi kia koutou, mai tawhiti, mai tata, me oku tuakana, koutou o te moana nui ā kiwa, nei aku mihi kia koutou. I te timatanga o taku kōrero, i kōrero au e pā ana ki ngā tua Māori, nā tipua Māori, heoi, ka tuku aku mihi anō ki wētahi atua. Ko Tangaroa, te atua o te moana, te tipua te moana, kia tāne mahuta, te tipua te atua o te nahere, kia maru, te atua o tātou nei, o mātou nei awa, me o tātou wai Māori, anō hoki kia haumi e tike, te tipua, te atua, te kai. Nei aku mihi kia koutou anō, e tika ana me taki tēnei huihuinga i roto i te karakia, hei pai haere, hei arahi pai tātou, i roto i tō tātou nei wānanga, heoi, kia ora mai tātou. Toki uri, amo, āki hoki au e tāku toki nei, kia rahirahi tō ki, kia rahirahi tō kāka, no hia te toki nei manihi, no hia te toki nei manaha, te manaha nui ia tāne, me whakarongo nui ake, nui mārire, te nei taku toki he ripona, taku toki he āwhena, tū mai te toki haumi e, hui e, tāiki e. Nei aku mihi kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou, katoa.
Kia ora te Pou, and thank you for blessing our talanoa. We're now going to move to the introduction of our panelists. And just as many of you would have experienced globally, using Zoom to connect across oceans and across landscapes, there's always going to be an issue with connectivity. So forgive us if we run into some of those issues today. But I'd like to invite Ursula Rakova from Bougainville in Papua New Guinea to introduce herself. Is she connected?
She seems to have dropped out again. She's back.
Hi, Ursula, can you hear us? Okay, cool. So we're having some technical difficulties. So I'm going to invite Amelia Ma'afu, Caritas Tonga. You're on mute, Amelia.
Malolele. My name is Amelia Ma'afu. I speak to you today from Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. Normally my home is in the beautiful kingdom of Tonga, but unfortunately due to the ongoing COVID crisis, I find myself grounded in Auckland since March of this year. Very much working remotely now, but very much with the hopes that there will be an opportunity to return to base very shortly. I've been with Caritas Tonga for 10 years now. Formerly, I joined Caritas Tonga office in 2010 as a project officer, and then became the project coordinator for 7 years. Currently, I am the national director. I have been privileged to journey with the SEFO report since its foundational report in 2014. It has been an honor to continue to be affiliated with such an important platform that has enabled voices of Oceania, though small individually, have become strongly amplified through this great work of partnership. Malo apito.
Malo apito, Amelia. Bula Kosi.
Bula Vinaga team. I'm Kosi Tatino Tiko Maimbula Tangani. I work, I'm the coordinator of social ecological justice for Caritas Archdiocese of Suva, what is known as Caritas Fiji. It's a very new baby within the Caritas family. We just started last year in March, and just my passion in terms of the work of SEFO environment began too last year when we opened, and I find it a passion in terms of looking at communities in Fiji who are being affected by the issue of climate change as well as sea level rise. And so I'm glad to be part of the SEFO Oceania report to work on amplifying the voices of the victims of climate change. Thank you, Tim. Tim, you are on mute.
Vinaka Kosi. Martin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Tim. So I was just trying to connect with Ursula. She is there in the studio and she will try again after I introduce myself to speak. She just has to stop the video at the moment because there's not quite capacity. But if she can't speak through Zoom, we will get her on the phone. So thank you for that and thanks for your patience. Kia ora tātou. I'm Martin de Jong. I'm really, really pleased to be able to be here to launch this year's SEFO report online, a very unusual situation, but it's great to be able to connect with all of you in this way. I would describe myself as the product of colonisation in various ways. My father came from the Netherlands to work in a dairy factory on the slopes of Taranaki in New Zealand's North Island. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was Anglo-Indian. He came as an orphan to New Zealand and fought for the Empire in World War I in Gallipoli, France and Belgium. My mother and grandmother on her side were both born in Aotearoa New Zealand, of English stock. I myself was born on the Hauraki Plains, where Captain Cook arrived, and he saw the Kahikatea pines that then covered the wetland, saw them as resources for the massive sailing ships. That area, which in my own psyche I call home and identify with, is now largely flat green fields supporting dairy. I'm not saying anything wrong about dairy, I'm just saying how the landscape has been transformed by our settlement and our colonisation. Where I live now in Whanganui-a-Tara, on the banks of Te Awa Kaurangi, the river of great value, is also a region, an urban area of modified landscape from the original wetland, providing a home for many people of diverse cultures. Te Whanganui-a-Tara, or Wellington, has been my home for more than half my life now, and I fell in love with it when I first arrived, mainly for the mountains and hills that surround this harbour. I've been working on the environment report since it started in 2014. I've always had a special connection with place and nature. And my journey on the report and with Caritas has only deepened my awareness and knowledge and understanding of Māori ways of relating to landscape and Indigenous ways. And seeing and experiencing people's deep connection with land, with ocean, with their ancestors. And it's made me appreciate my own connection with my past, the place where I live now, but also the places where my ancestors came from. We'll try Ursula now.
Kia ora, Martin. Thank you. Ursula, can you hear us? Are you there?
I'll try phoning her. It's worked before. You may not be able to see her face, but you can hear her, I hope. We have this in trials, don't worry. She usually comes through clear on the phone. Good morning, Ursula. I've got you on the Zoom call. You just introduce yourself briefly and I'll put her on speaker.
Thank you. Okay, I do that.
Ursula? Ursula, just, hello Ursula, it's Martin here. Just turn off the audio from your computer so it's not interfering, and just introduce yourself briefly to people in the webinar.
Okay, okay, I'm ready to start, Martin.
Yep, go ahead, Ursula.
Good morning, all, and good morning, Martin. Thanks for getting me to join this. Although you cannot see my face, you can hear my voice. I'm privileged to be part of this meeting, and my name is Ursula Lakeba, and I come from the Patrick Islands, which is impacted heavily by climate change and rising sea level. I am now the executive director of Tonga, which is an organization initiated by the Council of Elders in Patrick. And we have been in operation since 2006. This is our 11th year of operation, and we have managed to relocate only 10 families in 2009, 2011. The families are happy to be there. They're basically taking part in cash cropping and food security. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula.
Thank you, Tomas, Ursula. I'm now going to hand it over to Martin to provide us with some background on the report series and some of the issues covered. Kia ora, Martin.
Kia ora, Tim, and thank you everyone for your patience in dealing with this technology. But it's good to have backup such as phones. The Caritas Oceania Environment Report series we consider as fulfilling the mandate given to the Church in this region, arising from a synod near the beginning of the millennium, of meeting of bishops for Oceania in conjunction with Pope John Paul II, where they called upon the governments and peoples of Oceania to protect our precious environment here for present and future generations, and on behalf of all humanity, acknowledging that the Pacific Ocean contains about half the world's supply of water. Caritas Oceania members seek to serve the poorest. In doing that, we are aware of the increasing role environmental challenges, especially climate change, have in people's lives. In 2014, we brought these experiences together in the first advocacy report called Small Yet Strong, Voices from the Environment in Oceania. From that foundational report, we identified 5 issues to follow in subsequent years: extreme weather, coastal erosion, flooding and sea level rise, the environmental impacts on food and water supplies, offshore mining and drilling, and response to climate change impacts through monitoring climate finance for the most vulnerable. Our reports have always sought to seek out and amplify voices from the grassroots and coastal edges of Oceania. a testament of people's experience here. In this presentation, you'll hear stories from Tonga, Fiji, and Papua New Guinea. But in the report are others from Samoa, Australia, Aotearoa New Zealand, Vanuatu, and Kiribati. One of those deals with water supply situation in Northland and Pangaru. Just a short excerpt in the report. And just before joining this webinar, I was on another call to Pangaru. And both Phil and I were shocked at the continuing lack of secure water there following the drought. It was a real insight into the issues. And more of that will feature online as well. But a feature of our reports is our Caritas indicators. Please move to the slide with the indicators now, Cheryl. Next one. These are a snapshot assessment for the year based on the stories we receive, as well as monitoring of other reports and news items, which give our view, our assessment of the impact on people of these 5 issues. Just noting some movement in our indicators this year, both coastal and offshore indicators have moved up. Our assessment of coastal erosion and sea level rise has moved from high to severe, reflecting ongoing cases on coastal areas and the interplay of coastal erosion and flooding with extreme weather. Our assessment for offshore mining and drilling has moved for the first time from moderate to high. The physical impacts may not be getting visibly worse. What we are seeing is a continued push by seabed miners in particular, which is placing stress on communities who are having to defend their waters, traditional kaitiaki or guardianship areas, and their sources of seafood. Climate finance has remained woefully inadequate through the whole report series, and this highlights the marginalising and sidelining of those most affected by climate change. There is still insufficient support for community-led adaptation.
Kia ora, Martin. Thank you for that brief context. I just want to check if our friend Ursula is connected.
Are you able to speak, Ursula, on Zoom, or shall I call you again? I'll call her up.
Okay. Cool. Well, Martin calls her. So this brings us to our first case study from the grassroots. So Ursula Rakova, Tulele Pesa, the Carteret Island. So the first report featured Carteret Islands in PNG, and their story told through the eyes of Ursula Rakova of having to move because of climate change. So Ursula and her people have struggled to get sufficient funding from their Bougainville and Papua New Guinea governments, and struggled along with many other small islands to get recognition and finance to address the loss and damage which they can see visibly is affecting their homes. It was one of the reasons why our initial assessment of climate finance for the most vulnerable people in 2015 was woefully inadequate, and unfortunately that's remained so through to today. So Ursula has been the director of Tulele Pesa since it was founded in 2006 to organize migration of Carteret Islanders from Atoll Islands to mainland Bougainville. So she will explain the situation of her people and also provide us an update on climate finances.
Okay, go ahead, Ursula. On the phone.
Yeah, the voice is cutting off as well.
That's right. We can hear you clearly, Ursula. You can just.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll introduce myself again.
No, just go ahead and update us on the situation with Carteret Islands and climate finance.
Okay. In terms of relocation and what has happened so far, we have moved 10 families with support from churches, especially in Germany, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. We have attended several UNFCCC meetings, especially the Cancun meeting, and that was when climate financing was basically mapped out as support for impacted communities. Since that time, we have followed the events on climate financing, but we have not really we have not really benefited from climate financing since then. And today on the island, the situation is getting worse. More and more people would like to move to mainland Bougainville, but it's difficult for us to move these people and put them, just put them to crowd in one place. We would like to support these people with permanent homes, so they can later on be able to improve on those homes in the next 20, 30 years. But we are not able to do that because the relocation program is not financed fully to respond to the needs of the Caritas Islanders. And when the situation is getting worse, it's even difficult for us to access climate financing. Because the criteria set for climate financing responds to early warning systems, it responds to other requirements that we basically, for the Caritas, we have moved beyond those scenarios already.
Thank you, Ursula.
Thank you, Tomas. Ursula, thank you for that insight into the struggles of people having to move due to climate change. We now turn to Amelia Maafu, the Director of Caritas Tonga, for an analysis of extreme weather patterns affecting Oceania in recent years, particularly as they have been experienced in Tonga. Malo, Amelia.
Malo, Tim. The Caritas assessment of the overall impact on people of extreme weather events remains at severe. In light of our assessment of the last 5 to 10 years, where we have seen substantial change in weather for the people of Oceania. In many places, the temperatures have become noticeably warmer and the weather more unpredictable. Extreme events have become more intense and more frequent. Extreme weather events stand out as the single most pertinent environmental issue to people's lives and their livelihoods. It is well documented that Oceania island nations are highly exposed to multiple natural hazards, largely due to our geographical location. But climate change further exacerbates the vulnerabilities. In Tonga, climate change is recognized as the single biggest issue that will determine the future of Tonga over the coming decades. Climate change is already occurring in Tonga through both sea level rise and changes in climate. This is reflected in the intensity of extreme weather events. Unusual intense events such as the heat wave in Australia of 2014, leading to 139 deaths, super cyclones such as Pam in 2015 and Winston in 2016, El Nino effects affected more than one country in Oceania. Intense rainfall events and unusual sea swells have highlighted the dangers posed by extreme weather in Oceania. Intense storms causing extensive flooding in Aotearoa New Zealand and the bushfires of Australia in 2018. Category 5 tropical cyclones Yutu in the Northern Marianas and Gita in Tonga caused thousands of people to be displaced and many experienced shortages of food. A growing trend of multiple disasters affecting the same communities and compounding challenges, often already crippling coping capacity of vulnerable communities. The poor are the hardest hit. While disaster losses in Pacific Islands are highly relative to the size of their population and economies, many of the poor people live in areas particularly susceptible and or are affected by extreme weather events, and their means of subsistence are largely dependent on natural reserves and ecosystemic services such as agriculture, fishing, and forestry. They have no other financial activities or resources which can enable them to adapt to climate change or face natural disasters, and their access to social services and protection is also very limited. Extreme weather events directly impact crops, food plants, and food chains. Some species are finding new ways to survive, while others are sadly struggling or fading away. Disaster preparation and planning in a number of places in island countries prove effective for the extreme weather events that did hit, but greater priority is still required to the most vulnerable communities and those in isolated areas, as well as better coordination and involvement of people at grassroots. As well as the potential for extreme weather events to adversely affect more than one island nation in Oceania, the presence of other emergencies can further compound the difficulties experienced by countries already at a stretch point. Severe tropical cyclone Harold, for example, category 5, in March of 2020, wreaked havoc in Vanuatu as it traveled through with destructive winds as high as 235 kilometers per hour. TC Harold tracked towards Fiji as a category 4 and caused widespread flooding across Fiji. TC Harold then moved towards Tonga as a category 4. As well as tropical cyclone, the compounding crisis facing the world today of COVID-19 resulted in Tonga facing a dual emergency. TC Harold visited Tonga like many of its Pacific neighbors whilst the national lockdown was enforced. Tonga has maintained its COVID-19 free status. There are currently no suspected cases. In spite of its COVID-free status, the high rate of NCDs in Tonga, a developing health system, lack of ICU beds and ventilators, and heavy reliance on import, and the nature of our culture, for example, the community orientated with extended family ties, will amplify the impact of COVID if it is imported into the country, leaving us very vulnerable to potentially thousands of deaths and countless more very sick. To understand and highlight the compounding difficulty vulnerable communities in Tonga are facing in the aftermath of a significant cyclone with reference to the current pandemic, I would like to introduce my wonderful and very competent colleague, Maria Losa Tapueluelu, who is currently the program's assistant of Caritas Tonga, but also the Caritas Oceania youth delegate to Caritas Internationalis, to provide a case study of the experience of Tonga with a dual emergency. Malo Maria Losa.
Malo Amelia. Malo Apito Amelia and Malo Dene. Greetings from Tonga. Thank you for the opportunity given to share what happens and what it's really like here in Tonga in terms of the dual emergency that our small nations is facing, which is having to deal with the impacts of the novel coronavirus and also the impacts of natural disasters like Tropical Cyclone Harold. As Amelia have mentioned, Tropical Cyclone Harold enters the Tonga water whilst the country is on lockdown. And the authority have to lift some of the restrictions, especially the curfews, enabling the families that needed to evacuate to safer shelter to do so before the cyclones arrives. From what we have learned during our emergency response after the cyclone, that it was really hard for the families that evacuated to live in such a situation, especially when the COVID-19 restrictions still enforced after, and that they have to return to their own home, although some weren't safe enough to shelter them. Although Tonga is still COVID-19 free, it does not mean that we do not experience or undergo its impacts that other countries are dealing with. It also has a great impact on our economic and also our people's lives. Especially when Tropical Cyclone Harold came in the middle of this global pandemic. Its concerns have complicated sheltering decision of families that were affected by the cyclone. These have been identified by the shelter cluster that not even half of the families that were affected by the cyclone wanted to be a part of the government reconstructions recovery program. People are still stressing out, and especially the most vulnerable people living in low line of poverty, and people that were affected by the cyclone, that their priorities are being shuffled and they're being devastated, and the feeling of hopelessness is there. We are a small open island economy that mostly depends on foreign aid for major projects, and also some families depend on diasporas overseas. And with the COVID-19 restrictions, both locally and overseas, this creates a long-lasting economic damage to the businesses in Tonga, with loss of jobs and incomes. That some companies no longer afford to pay for so many employees, that results in laying off some of their workers. These especially is the tourist businesses, some construction companies, and some trading companies, and some others. Local traders are also being affected. They have shared that they no longer able to sell their handmade products like they used to be. In all these impacts that our small nations are facing and struggling with, it is the most vulnerable people, the people living in low line of the national poverty line, and some people that were affected by the cyclone. It is they who suffers the most. This has been witnessed that it is now over 6 months from when Tropical Cyclone Harold affects Tonga. We can still see people living in tents. We can still, we can still see people living in temporary shelter, and we can still see tarpaulins over some roof. From our previous survey in one of our projects, what have been shared from the communities is, and we believe it's the main concern here in Tonga, is when will be this pandemic over? Will it ever hit Tonga? Well, it's still unknown, and it is still unknown, yet we are only praying for the best and preparing for the worst, especially when we're just a month away from our next cyclone season. Malo pito and apologies.
No apologies needed. I think we all share in your emotions. Malo apito Amelia, Maria Rosa, and the rest of the Tongan team for that very important insight on extreme weather. We now move to Fiji, where Kosita Tino of Caritas Fiji will inform us about the intersect between coastal erosion, displacement of peoples, and climate finance. Bula vinaka Kosi.
Bula vinaka team, and bula vinaka to all of you listening to this webinar from across the ocean and from across the world as well. For me, the thematic area of which I will be speaking on is on coastal erosion and displacement, and how it interlinks with climate finance. In my deliberation, I will be touching on these two thematic areas, which is covered in the SEFO report. And I believe I do not have to go into details about the issue of sea level rise, and the factors associating with it. For there are many studies and scientific researches online to prove the cause and reality of the matter. However, it is important to note the link between sea level rise and coastal erosion, as in this experience here in Fiji. The reality of sea level rise is very much affecting small island nations like us in the Oceania, especially here in Fiji. The archipelago of Fiji consists of a group of more than 330 islands, of which about 100 are inhabited, and more than 60% of villages or communities situated along the coasts. Therefore, one can imagine the many communities that would be affected due to coastal erosion caused by sea level rise and other factors like storm surges and so forth. Caritas Fiji are raising awareness of climate change issues for coastal communities, so their voice as victims of climate change can be heard at national level and as well as globally. What drives our work around this area is because we believe the issue of climate change is mostly discussed at national and global level, with a lot of bureaucracy, especially when finances are involved, while the voices of the victims are not really being heard. Another drawback in this area is that many of these communities who are affected by coastal erosion cannot seem to connect the issue of climate change to sea level rise and coastal erosions, for they see it as something normal, despite the fact that they have witnessed firsthand that their coastlines are being swallowed up due to sea level rise. There are some of these are some of the pictures and images in terms of the impact of climate changes in the Pacific associated with coastal conditions. For example, through erosion or bleaches of coral bleaching, which is expected to affect local resources, example, fisheries, and reduce the value of these destinations for tourism. Sea level rise, as you can in the picture, is expected to exacerbate Indonesia's storm surge, erosion, and other coastal hazards, thus threatening vital infrastructures, settlements, and facilities that support the livelihood of the community. The impacts of climate change in the Pacific, just for example, the shifting of rainfall patterns causing prolonged droughts in some areas and excessive rainfall in others, including increase in frequency and intensity of cyclones. At the recent World Bank report states that Kiribati would experience flooding by rising seawaters of up to 80% of the land mass in some areas. A World Bank funded 2000 study found that in the absence of adaptation, up to 55 to 80% of areas in northern Tarawa and 25 to 50% of areas in southern Tarawa would be inundated in by 2050 due to sea level rise and storm surge, as you can see just highlighted in some of the stats there. This is an example of a king tide ledge in the Kiribati. A family climbed to safety when their house is hit by king tide in Basio on the South Pacific island of Kiribati in February 2005. So wave peaked at 2.87 meters. Next is just the impact of sea level rise as well in Pango. That is what we see, that the sea level rise, which is causing by storm surge, is affecting the island as well. In Tonga, a case study in Tonga, sea level rise near Tonga measured by satellite altimeters since 1993 is over 6 millimeter per year. I believe that will be more than by now, larger than the global average of 3.2 minus or plus 0.4 millimeter per year. So this rise is partly linked to a pattern related to climate vulnerability from year to year and decade to decade. A projected rise in sea level of 5 to 15 centimeter by 2030 and 20 to 60 centimeter by 2090. But sea level may be more at this point, maybe more, as this does not take into account the ice sheet disintegration processes, which will have a major impact on global sea levels. That is just an image along the Tonga. I hope those in Tonga wouldn't mind showing the impact of sea level rise and in Pangai Hospital. That is what they have done to somehow protect the hospital in terms of the impact of sea level rise. The next is a picture from the Solomon Islands, which is also a witness of the sea level rise that I am talking about. The next, this picture shows an island here in Fiji. The road has been almost half eaten out by coastal erosion, and this is in the island of Lau in Lakeba. As well as the next picture shows that this sea level rise has taken off the whole road in this island of Lakeba. The next picture, that is a headman from one of the villages here in the north. I'm here in the north. I'm sitting here under the guava tree, and this is a place in the north where he's pointing out that there at the boat he's pointing at where the house used to be in the 80s. So 20 years later, so some 40 years later, that is the sea level has gone right up to where he is standing. So I believe it is quite alarming. In Fiji's case, communities living along the coastal areas in Fiji face upheaval in the next few years as there are plans for relocations because of rising sea levels. Fiji's government has identified more than 40 coastal villages for relocations, but I question the fact whether these communities were consulted or not, because no one in Fiji seems to know who these communities are. Nevertheless, we need to heed the lesson of Narikoso on Ono Island in Kadavu. In 2012, the Fiji military began clearing the land to relocate the village of 100 people. The project stalled when overseas funding stopped and ecological degradation ensued, according to the 2019 case study by Armanda Bertana in 2019 titled Sea Level Rise, Valuable Lessons for the Narikoso Village Relocation Project in Fiji, in case studies in the environment 2019. So this year, 3 partly completed houses at the site, at the new site in Narikoso, were destroyed by Cyclone Harold. Despite locals warning, the houses' locations would be susceptible to cyclones. In terms of climate finance, most of the affected communities have minimal or no idea at all about climate finance here in Fiji. And it is easy to use them or manipulate them and their situation to attract climate funding. However, when money actually donated by others in terms of nations and partners for the purpose mentioned, it is used elsewhere according to the government priorities and not according to the victims' priorities. February this year, the new government pledged New Zealand 2 million to the Fiji Government Relocation Trust Fund to help relocate 42 communities threatened by sea level rise. I did question how well the money will be used based on the flow experience on Narikoso village. New Zealand MFTA says that 0.5 million of their grant will help develop relocation guidelines that provide human rights free, prior informed consent, transparency, and accountability due to relocations. But I believe this is very important. This is very important stages. Nevertheless, it does not seem to materialize on the ground. The first village that was relocated in Fiji, Vunindongoloa in Vonolevu, experienced this, and they are finding some problems in the new village where they are now settled, for the process mentioned above were not really being followed. And that, dear friends who are listening, is the experience that I can see thus far from Fiji with regard to coastal erosion and relocations or displacements with interlink with the climate finance situations here in Fiji. Thank you very much, Tim.
Vinaka Vakalivu Kosi, some very important follow-up questions in terms of climate finance, and I hope we can pick them up in the Q&A session. So from the coastal edges, we move offshore to look at the murkiness, not so much of the water, but the shady dealings of some of the companies wanting to extract goods from the sea, even to depths of 3 kilometers. So Martin De Jong backgrounds key findings from the report in the offshore section. Kia ora, Martin.
Kia ora, Tim. I'll try and keep this short because I know we're running close to, well, beyond time. We have followed offshore mining and drilling over the years, but this year have focused our attention on seabed mining. As I said before, the indicator has been raised to high because of the increased commercial pressure to mine in both national and international waters. There's a particular large region northeast of Kiribati that many countries are interested in. This is placing greater stress on some Pacific communities most affected, who, as you've already heard, have the stresses of climate change, poverty, and now COVID complicating their lives. And largely behind the scenes are these moves to mine the seafloor. In particular, we've followed in Papua New Guinea the progress or lack of in Solwara 1. Canadian-based Nautilus Minerals was in a joint venture with the PNG government to open the world's first commercial seabed mine called Solwara 1. Plans have been delayed. Nautilus ran into financial and technical difficulties. Last year went into receivership. That seemed like a sign of hope, but as communities in Papua New Guinea found, there is still a company called Deep Sea Mining Finance, which has taken over the assets of the Nautilus subsidiary, Nautilus New Guinea Limited. This company, Deep Sea Mining Finance, is owned by the main investors of the now bankrupt Nautilus, and through Nautilus New Guinea, it has continued to apply for exploration licenses in the Solwara 1 area. In July of this year, John Mamori of Caritas in Papua New Guinea, together with Jonathan Mesalam and others from the Alliance of Solwara Warriors, helped to support community objections to this license extension. It happened in Namatanai, New Ireland. It was outdoors. We have photos of the people on the ground putting their case to the Mineral Resources Authority. This was the first time this year that the people and even the New Ireland provincial government heard that Deep Sea Mining Finance was around and had acquired the assets. It was also the first time that they heard that a previous license renewal, which they objected to 2 years ago, the first time they heard that that license had gone ahead. It was the first time they'd got an update on the situation. It's one of the many reasons why the Catholic Church and other members in the community in Papua New Guinea have been strongly opposed to seabed mining of any sort. It's for this reason, as well as strong opposition to seabed mining in places such as Tonga, Fiji, Cook Islands and Kiribati, that Caritas Oceania this year is joining for a call for a complete ban on seabed mining and exploration in both international and national waters in the Pacific. I understand through our networks that there will probably be shortly a fuller Pacific campaign against seabed mining, probably calling for a ban in national waters and exclusive economic zones and a moratorium in the international area. There's reasons why there's a difference there, which I can't go into, it's too complicated, but those who are interested in this issue, we will have more on our website and through our contacts. So watch this space, basically, and keep an eye on what's happening offshore. Thank you, Tim.
Kia ora, Martin. So that brings to an end our overview to some of the issues covered in the report. So we're now going to conclude with each of the panelists giving their key conclusion and recommendation arising from the Caritas analysis. And we'll start with our brother Kosi.
Thank you, Tim. In terms of my conclusion, COVID-19 has reminded us of our mutual vulnerability and interconnectedness and the need for solidarity. Government must remain committed to Paris Agreement, update strong nationally determined contributions on NCDs by end of the year. We must step up on climate mitigation, adaptation and finance, prioritize poorest communities and empower local communities to access funding. Not at further expense of the earth and the poor. A green transition does not include seabed mining. And my try to rebuild economies that serve people and planet and value and support local resilience, food production, ecosystems and communities, must ban further seabed mining and exploration and last but not the least, to improve climate finance. So thank you, Tim.
Vinaka Kosi.
I'll try. Do you want me to call up Ursula, Tim? Amalia. It's Amalia next.
We also call on governments to protect people's health and minimize the fallout from COVID-19, while stepping up efforts too on climate mitigation and adaptation. We can't let COVID-19 and economic concerns divert us from the long-term and growing threat of climate change. There is no UN climate summit this year, but countries must remain committed to update and strengthen their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement by the end of this year.
Thanks, Amalia.
Martin, will you speak to Ursula's one?
I will actually call up Ursula because she would like to speak briefly.
Sure.
Yep, you're online, Ursula. Just
Sorry?
you're online. Just speak with your summation.
I'm online.
Yep. Just give your summation of the key thing relating to climate finance you would like to tell us.
Okay.
Just go ahead, Ursula. I've got the phone next to the microphone, so just.
Yeah, hello everyone again. My short key message is on climate finance. Okay, thank you. Is that okay?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, my short key messages on climate financing is that I would call on governments sponsoring or financing climate impact to basically make sure that climate financing reaches communities that are heavily impacted and are vulnerable to climate change and rising sea level. And that is my call for the global leaders.
Okay, thank you. It's got really hard. Thank you, Ursula. Sorry, I got a bit cut short there, but we heard the essence of their message. For myself, I would say we need an integrated response that recognises natural cycles and limits and rests the earth so that ecosystems, nature and people can recover from the ravages of exploitation. All people need to be provided for fairly from the earth's resources. In particular, we don't wish to see further ecosystem destruction on the seabed floor, where we can't even go ourselves. Enough is enough. We want to see seabed mining and exploration banned.
Kia ora, Martin. And thank you to all of our panelists for your critical contributions to this Talanua. Very conscious of our time, island time, as they say in the islands. So thank you to our participants who've sent through a few questions. We're going to pose one question because I think it captures the essence of the other four to our panelists. And the question reads, with the threat of climate dislocation and migration of communities, what must we ask governments to do? So panelists, you can feel free to volunteer to address that question. Of course, he's got his mic off, so he's got an answer ready. So I'll just read that question again.
Yeah, no, I get the question too. Yeah, I believe we should not only ask, but we should pressure our government to prioritize the need of the victims in terms of climate finance, rather than just prioritizing the governments, especially with the small governments, Oceania, like for us in Fiji. There's a lot of access through climate funding for the vulnerable communities who are affected by climate change and coastal erosions, and they are in need for assistance if there need to be relocations, which is urgent at the moment in time. And I believe it's not only about asking the government; it's about pressuring the government to, if they have been amplifying at global level about the victims' situations in Fiji, then should only they prioritize those who are actually vulnerable to climate change, rather than just focusing on government priorities. Thank you, Jim.
Minaka kosi. Amelia, would you like to offer some thoughts on that question?
Tim, are you able to repeat the question briefly, please?
Yep, sure. So the question reads, with the threat of climate dislocation and migration of communities, what must we ask governments to do?
I guess the question is quite a complex question. There are many asks as practitioners and organizations with direct relationships on the ground. I think there is a call for a better understanding of the experience at the local level and the prioritization of climate adaptation as seen in the eyes of local level communities. There's a need for greater understanding of the mechanisms by which communities feel that they are enabled, strengthened to become more resilient. And I think from the perspective of Caritas Tonga, with the amount of engagement on the ground, I think there's a call for a bridging of the working relationship of the government with communities on the front line through an integrated partnership with all of the main stakeholders. And I think through a more a close working relationship, a working partnership between government and all actors that can strengthen the ability of frontline communities to adapt and strengthen their resilience.
Maro Pito, Amelia. Martin and Maria Losa, would you like to offer some thoughts?
I will first just reinforcing what Ursula said, that climate finance needs to address the most poorest, and where possible and feasible, adapt and provide for basic needs where people are. That's the first choice. Malia Lawson, who highlighted the need for basic shelter, food and water, and that's what needs to be done first. But also picking up on preparing for the worst, if people do have to move, recognise the complications in that, ideally within country, but also we need to recognise our responsibility as a region, particularly more affluent parts of the region, not to speak in countries, but communities need to be open to support movement and migration of people. You know, once we're through COVID restrictions and that, but recognising the many connections that people have, family connections, whānau connections between different places, and support and openness to welcome people who may be forced to move, as in the situation with the Kariru Islands. We're all sisters and brothers on this planet. We've all got connections with particular places, but we've also got friends and support in different regions and potential friends. You know, people who may need to welcome others who have no home to go to. So I think government policies need to focus on that and also support people rather than infrastructure. Infrastructure is just a means to an end. The priority is people's basic needs.
Thank you, Martin. Yes, I'm very conscious of the time. Sorry, Martin, you go ahead.
I suggest that we wrap up with a prayer. Anyone who wants to stay on for further discussion, even informal discussion, we can go till 2:30. That would be my recommendation.
Yes, thanks, Martin. And thank you to all our participants for joining in this webinar. So we hope that we sincerely hope that the report will serve as a useful tool for collective advocacy and activism in your various spaces. And we also hope that the report will help to generate deep and reflective conversations between families and communities as we move forward together. So apologies for the time limit, but there are opportunities to engage further and deeper in the materials that have been shared. So the State of the Environment report is available on the Caritas New Zealand website. You can see the link in the chat box. You can also engage in extended talanoa on the themes of the report through the Oceanian Facebook group page. So that link has also been included in the chat. So to close our talanoa with a word of prayer, I invite you to join me in reciting the Canticle of the Sun by St. Francis. Can I ask Martin to lead us?
Yeah. Just unmute if you want to. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother Sun, who is the day through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears the likeness. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars. In the heavens you made them bright, precious, and fair. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brothers Wind and Air, and fair and stormy, all weather's moods, by which you cherish all that you have made. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Water, the useful, humble, precious, and pure. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, producing varied fruits with coloured flowers and herbs. Praised be you, my Lord, through those who grant pardon for love of you and bear sickness and trial. Blessed are those who endure in peace. By you, Most High, they will be crowned.
Thank you once again. For those of you who'd like to stay behind, you're most welcome to do so. For everyone else, I'm conscious everyone probably has meetings or other important plans for the weekend. We wish you all the best and look forward to continuing this engagement online. Mano.